Okay, welcome to writer-based writing, which is where we think about invention, about making our case in our paper. Okay, so start with our framework for our tutors and for writers themselves. And I call it an analytical framework because these are the things that good writers think about, and I'm sure there are other things in addition that good writers think about when they're writing, okay, or before they're writing, or even after they're writing. So good writers think about all these different things, and it's probably not the best representation of what's involved in the process of writing a paper. But there's, for instance, the fact that I have it in a kind of a linear form is not really accurate. It'd be nicer if I could somehow get it to be more fluid or reiterative or recursive. The vision that I had for this analytical framework was more aligned with what you would think of when you're thinking about a lava lamp, with like blobs of lava coming from the top of the lamp and down from the bottom of the lamp and meeting each other and joining each other and mixing and separating, and very unpredictable manner, because we do all these things that you see here on the slide. But we might not necessarily do them in any particular order. We may be doing, something like we may be already drafting, and yet maybe we're going back to assess our situation because we're not quite sure if there's something we need to explain more or something like that. We may revise, we may start revising and realize that there's some information that we should have included, and we're going back to gathering information and taking notes. Those kinds of things. In terms of, we may be drafting or we may be revising and recognizing that we should probably check back with the assignment brief to make sure that we're hitting all the things that they wanted us to hit. We may be getting started and realize that we're in a panic mode, or we have writer's block or something like that. We have to check in with ourselves to figure out what's going on. So this is just the nature of writing. It's a really confusing, messy thing. Writing, I'd say writing isn't hard. Writing is just messy, and that's what makes it hard. So like if you were to come into the writing center to talk to a tutor, these are the kinds of things that they're going to be kind of inquiring about. They might say, like, tell me about your paper. What's it about? Does your paper try to answer a question? Or does it defend an interpretation? Or does it gather information to better understand some not well understood phenomenon in your field? So what is the word count requirement? When is it due? Right? These are all situational issues. And then process issues like, where are you now with your paper? Are you still drafting? Are there parts where you are beginning to revise, edit, and proofread? And then there may be, and then there's these meta strategies that we have to overcome obstacles. So I might, a tutor might say to you, so from what you say, you're having problems getting words down on paper, generating text. What's stopping you from writing? Are you bored with the paper, anxious, bogged down with too much information, and nothing to tie it together, right? So these are the kinds of questions we'd be asking, because we're trying to get a sense of you in terms of your process, in terms of your understanding of your writing situation, and in terms of, like what's going on with you as a writer in terms of in your head, in your heart, in your life, and in your process. And we're trying to locate what is stopping you from moving forward. And these are things that we're doing with you partly just to get you to do it to yourself. So when you listen, when a tutor asks you a question, they're asking you a question you should be asking yourself. And hopefully that's the learning outcome when you come to sit a session with a peer tutor in the Writing Center. Okay. I will say, the most unsolicited comment that we get from students who leave here after a session is that they really feel more confident when they're walking out the door than when they walked in. And so there's something to be said for that. Okay, so writer-based writing is what we do when we're trying to figure out what we want to say in our paper, okay? Normally, our reason for writing is that we've been given an assignment, and of course, When we sign up for a master's level or a doctoral level course, we're expected to produce a major research paper, a dissertation or a thesis, though other ways of being assessed in these programs are emerging, like by publication, etc., practicum, so forth. Regardless of whether the paper is in response to an assignment or a postgraduate course, expectation for a longer text, the situation needs to be assessed. We need to determine when are we going to work on producing the paper, what we are going to talk about, what others have said about it, and finally what we are going to say about it. Writer-based writing is all about invention. All right, so you can see down here, choosing a topic. This is all writer-based writing. This is like what we do in the early stages of writing. We assess the situation, we plan, we choose a topic, we gather information, we take notes, etc. Okay, so if I click on Invention, which is what this presentation is all about, it takes you to the Silva Rhetorica, the Forest of Rhetoric. And the reason I bring you here is because as you can see here, invention is one of the 5 canons of rhetoric, right? You can see that the content outlined here on the left, I'm pointing to it, the site's opening page, that invention is one of the 5 canons. And along with that is arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. And remember, in ancient Greece and Rome, rhetoric was the art of persuasion, and at the time, the mode of oration, not print. Right, so people were verbal, they weren't writing down things, they were talking. Nevertheless, the canons still apply, even in a writing situation. Once we figure out what we want to say, we have to figure out how to organize it logically so that the audience can follow, right? That's the arrangement side of things. The style has to be suited to the audience and the message, right? So there's the stylistic issue. Do we need to be formal, or does the audience respond better to a more conversational style? I guess if you're writing for a discipline, they want you to use certain language that is typical for people in your field. Does the audience need to be brought, and also, does the audience need to be brought slowly along to fully understand what is involved? Orators did not have teleprompters, so memory and order were important so that each point was addressed in the necessary order for understanding. Today, good writers package arguments in such a way that it's easy for the audience to retain each point. Finally, and when I say retain, remember, they can kind of like formulate it in their head, they can package it in their own brain, and so they understand it better because you've given them a way to remember it. So finally, delivery. Do we need to be forceful to emphasize the importance of the issue, or will the audience prefer that we carefully go through each point, highlighting the importance of each point, convincing the audience of the importance of the issue through methodical reasoning, right? Invention describes this is quoting from this page here on the second paragraph here. If I click on invention, you see here, invention concerns finding something to say. Its name derives from the Latin invenire, to find. Certain common categories of thought become conventional to use in order to brainstorm from materials. These places called topoi in Greek are called topics of invention. And if I click on that, you can see here things like, these are things that people do in order to kind of like come up with something to say. So the first thing they want to do is define terms, right? And sometimes you find that when you're going through other people's research, you discover that they're not all defining terms in the same way, and that could be a source of discord in the discourse, where people are not necessarily agreeing with each other, but it's not immediately clear why, and then you realize they're actually working from 2 different understandings of reality, right? Division, dividing things down into parts, which is something that you have to do when you analyze, right? What are the parts of this and how do they work together to form the whole? You can compare things for similarities and differences, or degrees of difference, degrees of similarity. Trying to establish relationship between different ideas, like, is this causing that? Did this come before that? Is this a consequence of something that preceded it? Is this contrary to that? And then circumstances, something is possible or it's impossible, it's a past fact, it's a future fact, that kind of thing. And then testimony, this would be, it's thought to be probably, well, it depends on what you're accessing here, but Testament tends to be in academic communities the least reliable, the least valid, but sometimes the preponderance of testimony can make a difference, right? So authorities, witnesses, maxims or proverbs, rumors, oaths, documents, law, precedent, supernatural, etc., and then notation and conjugates. So anyway, these are things that people will do, and they'll explore these ideas with the topic that they're talking about in order to know more about it, to develop their ideas. Okay, go back to Invention here. And yeah, and then Invention is tied. This is, I think, the most important paragraph, the second paragraph. Invention is tied to the rhetorical appeal of logos, logic, and word, right? Being oriented to what an author would say rather than how this might be said. So, right, and that's what this presentation is all about. In the early stages of writing, really we're more concerned with what we want to say, not how we're going to say it. And typically people get hung up on, they write a paragraph and they feel like they have to edit it to make it perfect, when in fact that's a waste of time, really. And maybe people do it sometimes in order for them to kind of maybe refine their thinking or something like that. But for the most part, it's better to get your ideas down, try to figure out what you want to say before you waste a lot of time making beautiful sentences and really unified paragraphs and all that thing, when you're not even going to use those sentences or those paragraphs later on, when you realize that they're really not relevant to what you're talking about, right? So in the early stages, we're just trying to figure out, what do I want to say here? So Invention describes the argumentative, persuasive core of rhetoric, and I think that's probably the most important sentence in this passage here. Aristotle, in fact, defines rhetoric primarily as invention, quote, discovering the best available means of persuasion, unquote. An important procedure that formed part of this finding process was stasis. And if you click on stasis, you see basically it names a procedure within rhetorical invention by which one would ask certain questions in order to arrive at a point at an issue in the debate. The stasis, that's the stasis. It's the point at issue in the debate. That's what you're aiming for. You're trying to get that down to what that stasis is. And then there's 4 kinds of questions: conjectural, definitional, qualitative, etc. This is a really interesting website, and even though it's discussing ancient rhetoric, there's a lot in here that kind of informs how we think about writing in academic contexts. So there you go. That's a little bit about like why I'm talking about this. Okay. So let me go to the next slide here. So assessing, and this is going back to, like, if I go back up, you see assessing the situation, planning, choosing a topic, etc. So I'll go through that. Like assessing the occasion for writing, the context is academic. You're either writing for academic assessment or publication, right? And academic papers are typically argumentative. So what do people in your field argue about? And those are topics that would be relevant to you. What can I, and of course, then there's also the context in terms of like time and space. I have an assignment, I have 2 weeks to write it, I have 2,000 words to write. So what can I meaningfully say or argue in the space or the time allotted to me? And what are the grading criteria? And what are the learning outcomes that I need to think about when I'm putting this thing together? Because ultimately, my purpose is to get a good grade. So these are things I gotta think about. So what are some of the points of contention in the literature you read for the class, your class or course? What are some of the unanswered questions being pursued by scholars in your field? These questions, these problems, these assertions, these hypotheses are the topics on which scholars in the field are currently discoursing, okay? So, and obviously, the more recent the publication, the more likely you have an up-to-date idea of what's going on in your field. So as an undergraduate, one of the things that you want to think about, especially if you have to write a final year project, is getting an overview of the field and all the different issues that are relevant to people in your field, and then kind of honing in on a few that you find very interesting, because there's nothing worse than writing a long paper when you're bored with the topic, right? You want to find something that really interests you and focus on that. In a master's program, obviously you've done that already as an undergraduate, so you already have an idea. But what you find is that you could be even more refined in what you're looking at. Instead of looking at this entire discourse on a certain problem, you may be attracted to certain aspects of the conversation, and so you're more focused. And of course, even more focused when you do a PhD, right? So does the assignment restrict you to the discourse on a particular problem in your field? Okay, there may be something in the assignment brief that is telling you, look at this, study this, tell it, give us your input, or see what can you say about this issue and how it might be resolved, that kind of thing. And if there is room for play, that helps you in terms of like focusing on what you'd rather talk about. So you might think in terms of the scope of the problem and how restricted you are in terms of how you deal with it based on what you see in the assignment brief. And into which conversation in your field will you insert yourself? Because that's what we do. When we look at an issue in our field, we're reading. When we read, it's people talking to us. And so what we want to do is talk back to them or to engage in that conversation. So which conversation do you want to get into? So the time and space requirements will influence the scope of your argument, right? You can't be super comprehensive or super detailed if you have a 500-word essay and you have 2 days to write it. It's highly unlikely you're going to do a lot of research. You're probably going to be doing a little bit of research and maybe get an encyclopedic view of something, but it's not very deep in its understanding. Whereas if you have, let's say, 3,000-word essay and you have 6 weeks to write it, that's a whole different story. And obviously you're going to get into a lot more detail and a lot more depth of understanding of the issues, and you're going to have space to actually explain to the reader your ability to engage with those issues. So in addition to engaging in a conversation about a problem that concerns you and your field, you will also want to consider grading criteria and rubrics and learning outcomes. And if you can demonstrate your ability to perform any of the learning outcomes while making your case, you'd be feeding two birds with one stone, right? Because you're not only making a good argument and satisfying the assignment brief, but you're also demonstrating that you can perform the learning outcomes. So that's always going to stand you in a better position when it comes time to get a grade, okay? So again, assessing the situation or the occasion for writing. Who is my audience is a big question. What are the grading criteria, the learning outcomes? Is there a grading rubric? What are the standards? Who discourses on the problem I'm addressing? Who talks about it? Who has done studies on it? Who has written about it? Why was the problem important to them, to the people who wrote about it? What did they want to know when they engaged in research on the problem? How did they go about trying to resolve the issue? What did they do in order to find out more information? What did they find when they did it? And what did they make of their findings? And what did they conclude? Were there other scholars who challenged their findings, the conclusions? Did others approach the problem differently? How have these studies in the scholarly discourse influenced your approach in your paper? What is your question? What will you do in order to attempt to answer it? What do you anticipate finding? What will you be able to conclude if your anticipated findings materialize, right? So, the overriding question is, what do I want this paper to do? And hopefully, your purpose is to get an A, but if you're happy with a pass, that's what you want to do. And what will it take to either get an A or to get a pass, right? So how are past writing experiences influencing my approach to this assignment? What did I do well in my last paper? Where did it go wrong? And what can I do differently this time, right? And you can see on the slide there, these are all things that I've just basically talked about. So we need to consult audience for assistance in determining the relevance of the argument, locating information that will help us to make our case. And later, In reader-based writing mode, and I'll talk about that in another presentation, we'll need to pay attention to the more formal issue of style and arrangement and delivery. We need to consider our purpose, and if it is merely to get a pass grade, what will suffice, and if it's to get an A or more, what will that take, and how much more time is involved. For people who've had A's before, I imagine there are some people for whom A's come easy. There's not many of us that happens to. So obviously there's more work involved for an A student than to get an A than there is to get a C or a low B or something like that. It really comes down to what you're satisfied with. I'm personally never satisfied with a B, but that doesn't mean I always got A's. You know, sometimes in the interest of, I guess out of self-interest, I would write papers that I knew probably wouldn't get good grades, but they satisfied me. I wanted to write those papers. I did it. I couldn't be mad at anybody but myself, but what the heck, you live once. The writer's always part of the rhetorical situation, right? When you look at Aristotle's, the kinds of things that he asks orators, and in our case writers, to look at, you know, one of the things that Aristotle points to is that the writer needs to self-analyze as well, right? You're always part of the rhetorical situation. And also the people that are assessing the submission are part of the rhetorical situation. So we're talking to an audience of people who discourse on a particular problem, but we have to take account of ourselves, and we have to remember that there's another audience that's assessing us. And the assessment is based on something that really might not necessarily be part of the discourse. For instance, sometimes, I guess a lot of times, you see papers that don't do well, and the student might say something like, well, the teacher said I should have explained it, but why should I explain it? They know what this is about. And of course, the problem is that, yeah, the teacher does know what it's about, the lecturer or whoever's grading the paper. They know, they understand these concepts. They can explain it to themselves. The problem is they're not sure if you can explain them to the lecturer or the person assessing the paper. And that's a really important thing to remember. They're measuring your ability, to operate and to, I guess, execute high-level cognitive processing of information. And that requires that you do things like explain things, analyze things, apply ideas to situations, synthesize information, and evaluate information. Those are all important in terms of determining how much you actually know here. So questions you ask of yourself, like, what is my past experience with writing? Did I have good experiences or bad experiences? And if they were bad experiences, what can I do differently this time to move toward a better outcome? And sometimes talking to a tutor is really helpful because they can help you find out what it is that wasn't working. Is the teacher known for harsh grading? Do they have pet peeves? Are there any unstated requirements? Do you know someone who's had this teacher in the past? Maybe you can consult with them and kind of get a sense of, where this teacher's at in terms of what they value, okay? So that when they grade the paper, you are prepared. Planning. When is the paper due? How many words do you have to write? This is the time and space issue, right? What else competes for your time? Other class hours, assignments, exams, jobs, etc., significant others. When will you work on this paper? Look at your calendar. Protect the time when you're going to devote yourself to this assignment. And what will I try to get done today, this week, by the end of next week, 3 days before the due date? All right. I mean, we've had people who had difficulty writing because they needed pressure to write. And so they would write the paper the night before. They got B's and they wanted A's. And so, one of the ways that we suggested that person might achieve better grades is by putting on the pressure earlier. In other words, having a draft due a couple of days before the paper's due, and then spend the next, the night before the paper's due revising, something like that, right? So get out your calendar, create a Gantt chart that keeps track of the deadlines for all of your obligations, the assignment due dates, the exam dates, the work hours, how much time before the paper's due. What are my past experiences of writing papers? What goes slowest? Am I a slow reader? Am I a slow writer? Am I a slow drafter? Am I, what is it? Do I go through innumerable drafts to get to where I want to be? Do I spend a lot of time organizing notes, and does that save time when writing? Giving yourself targets for each day or week or month is helpful, and these targets are provisional. It takes time to develop a plan that anticipates problems that frustrate the plan, so try to anticipate any problems. And it's also important to remember that a plan is something that you're aiming at. If you don't get there, you can't jump out the window because you feel like the whole thing's lost, right? You have to revise your plan. That's all there is to it. So how much time do I have before submitting my paper? How much space needs to be filled with text? What does the space and time allocation allow? Will I need to narrow or expand the topic, the scope of my argument? What else is competing for my time is important also to consider. When can I work on this paper? Am I looking at nights and weekends, or can I work on the paper between classes? What can I get sorted by the end of the week, the end of next week, etc.? Okay, so these are important questions when planning. It's one of the things a tutor would talk to you about, like what's your plan, and try to get a sense of like when are you going to work on this paper, and especially if you have, pardon me, 4 or 5 papers due in the course of a couple of weeks, you want to make sure that you're kind of juggling all those things, and that really does require planning. Okay, so in terms of choosing a topic, typically academic papers argue, they make a case, right? And that's what Invention's all about. They typically either take a position on a contested point, or they attempt to understand something not currently well understood by experts in the field. And then the way that we talked about the stasis, which is the kind of the thesis statement, the question that you are trying to answer, or the problem you're trying to solve, or the hypothesis you want to test. So different fields have different kind of conventions. Some fields start with a question. My field, literary criticism, would always start with a claim, right? You would make a claim and then you would defend the claim over the course of the paper. The conclusion would basically be a reiteration of the main points of the argument. Some papers start out with a statement of a problem and then specify some things they're going to do in order to get a better understanding of what's going on there, and then maybe there'll be a conclusion that either is the solution to the problem, or it would be an identification of further work that needs to be done before a solution is possible. A question ends up with an answer, a problem with a solution, a claim with a defense, and a hypothesis with a test, the results of which either affirms or negates the hypothesis, right? Does the hypothesis hold is really what that's about. So, as it's an academic paper, the paper will likely be required to make a case. And we do have a PowerPoint on our website called Developing and Organizing Arguments, so you might take a look at that. We need to think about the reading requirements and the optional readings for the module of the course. What kinds of issues are current in the field? What are people arguing about? What is not well understood in my field? And in what direction is the research currently trending? These are areas to consider for the topic of the paper. And when you choose a topic, the topic is most likely in the form of a question, or the statement of a problem, or a claim, or a hypothesis that your research reasoning will treat, right? The important thing to do when reading for your class is to identify how the authors of the texts you are reading are making their case. Do they begin with questions or statements of problems or claims or hypotheses? How do they typically begin? The important point is that each type of thesis statement, each type of statement of the problem, whatever, a question or a statement of the problem or a claim or a hypothesis, announces a predictable unfolding of the argument. We know that if you ask a question, everything is moving toward an answer. If you state a problem, we're assuming your whole motivation of the paper is to get to either a solution or to some information that will help you to see what kind of things to do next in order to get to that solution. If you start with a claim, the assumption is the entire paper unfolds into a defense. And then if you start with a hypothesis, you know that you're going to test that hypothesis somehow. So you need to tell us how you're going to test it. And then based on what you find, and you have to justify that the findings are actually going to allow you to either affirm the hypothesis or negate it. Or in some cases, you may discover that you just don't have enough information to do either. And like the statement of the problem paper, you may end up just suggesting further research or more tests in order to get the kind of information that you need in order to affirm and negate the hypothesis. So the movement of the argument should be scaffolded. We should be given the information in each paragraph that's necessary and that prepares us for what we're going to be told in succeeding paragraphs. The unfolding should be logical and coherent. Okay. Gathering information and taking notes. Okay. Gathering information. This is like who else. We're looking for information that will tell us like who else asked the question that I'm trying to answer, or the problem that I'm trying to solve, or whatever it is. Who else is talking about this problem? Who else is making this claim or contesting it? Who else has formed a hypothesis about what is happening here? What do these people read? That's another really good question. What literature do they draw on to make their case, right? So that's, all journal articles and most books will have references and they'll have citations. And so when you read somebody else's work, you're seeing like, where did they get their information? What studies did they think were important? What theories did they think were important? What books did they go to? What articles did they draw on? What studies did they draw on, right? So what did these people read? What literature did they draw on to make their case? And across text, are there particular sources? Like if you have 5 or 6 articles and a couple of books, and you look through their reference pages, are there particular authors that all of them have read, all of them have cited and paid attention to? Because those are foundational authors, and you definitely want to pay attention to them. You want to, spend some time with them, because, if you understand those authors and their work, then you're really grounded in the discourse at that point. So, and if you introduce something new, that's great, but it's always in response. You always have to respond to the fact that the discourse so far has been grounded in a certain way of thinking, and any kind of alternate way of thinking that you're introducing is always a response to that. So, taking notes. Make sure that you're careful to record the source of the information that you take down in your notes. Quotes, paraphrases, summaries of others' work, findings or conclusions need to be cited and referenced in your papers. You cannot use what you cannot cite. Okay, so when you take notes, be sure that you put quotation marks around quoted material. If you quote or paraphrase or summarize somebody else's ideas or conclusions or findings, make sure you cite the page numbers on which you found it so that you can go back and you can look at it again, okay? And so other people can find it as well. Nothing worse than, you cite a quote that is in a book that has 600 pages, and we're supposed to go leafing through that book for 600 pages to figure out where the quote is, or the paraphrase or the summary. Page numbers should be there so that the people who follow you can basically, if they have any kind of doubts about your interpretation, through a paraphrase or summary, they can go and contest it. Okay. Also, they may want to look at the quote in terms of the context in which it was said, right? Good academic work means that you're open to challenge. And so you want to make sure you give the reader everything they need in order to give you a challenge if they think that one is warranted. Are you careful in your notes to put speech marks on each side of anything that is copied verbatim? Make sure, right? And be sure to write verbatim replications exactly as they're found in the original, even if there are misspellings, right? Or if there's, you write in British English and the text is in American English, you can't change the spelling because, you're trying to make it more like British English. You have to exactly as you see it is how it has to go down on the paper. The grammatical issues, everything else, if there's any problems, you replicate it exactly as it appears in the original, right? There's a convention that people use to indicate to the reader that this grammatical error or this spelling error is not mine. And what it is right after the error in square brackets, you write SIC, sick, and it's Latin for, and basically it signifies that the error is not mine. Basically, that's what that does. So that signifies to the reader that you didn't misquote or misspell, the original author did. So don't blame me, right? So ask yourself, what is your note-taking strategy? Do you have a single place where all of your notes are, for the paper are recorded? Are you being careful to note that with speech mark passages, what are taken verbatim from a source? And are you noting author, date, page in your notes, even when summarizing or paraphrasing or quoting? How will you begin? How will the text unfold? And how will you make your case? Are you going to begin with a question or a statement of a problem or a claim or a hypothesis? And how will the text unfold? How will you get to the conclusion? How will you, and what in that information that you're giving between the introduction where you state your question or problem or whatever and the conclusion, how will you make your case? What is the evidence that you're going to provide to support your conclusions? Okay. All right, so drafting, right? This is getting close to the end here of the presentation, but drafting would be kind of like the last thing less part of the writer-based writing mode of writing, all right, where you're starting to actually put down on paper your thoughts and trying to formulate them into words and ideas, etc., as you think they'll probably be expressed in the end, right? So writing papers can be a pretty messy process, and we write something, we reevaluate what we wrote, we erase it, we start over, we write something, we're happy with it, but we need to elaborate, but that requires reading. We make a note that we need to read X, Y, and Z before we can go any further with the idea. We move on to the additional ideas we think are important to include. We write some things but stop because we aren't yet able to explain the concept to ourselves, never mind to the reader. It's too complicated. We go back to a passage that covers that concept. We try again, but we stop. We stop not feeling we're ready. We try explaining it to our partner or a friend, or in my case, I talk to the dog. It's still not right. We go back to the paper, we try again. We aren't happy with the way we say it. We go back to the books. We're frightened we might be too close to the way the book explains it. So we want to make sure that we try to paraphrase or summarize better than we had originally. We write it again. It's not bad. We move on figuring that we'll come back to it later. If that sounds familiar, that's what writing is, right? So the process of developing a text is iterative, recursive, it's messy, right? And a good rule of thumb is to write what you're ready to write. Nothing kills the flow of ideas like concerns about how the ideas are expressed. This is a reader-based writing concern, not a drafting concern. Drafts are focused on what you want, what you're trying to say, not how you're trying to say it. So write without regard for style, order, grammar, or even coherence. Just put your ideas down as they come into your head. Parts of your draft will develop more quickly than other parts, of course, and do not move into reader-based writing unless you're certain the passage will survive future changes to the draft, right? Why waste your time editing, if that passage is going to be jettisoned at the end, right? Drafting is an opportunity to play with the organization of the argument and hence the paper, an opportunity to consider the best way of making the case. A draft is writing in process, not a product. So feel free to play with ideas and arrangements, okay? So drafting is the fun part, right? But it can also be the frustrating part, especially if you have an investment in saying certain things and having difficulty, getting it from your head onto the page, right? So some drafting strategies, and these are I'm looking back at Rowena Murray's Writing with a Thesis. She describes two text generating strategies, structuring and freewheeling. Generating text is half the battle. So there's nothing so daunting as a blank page, unless it's 6 or 60 blank pages, and that would really be daunting. It's a lot less daunting to edit what you've written already than it is to fill a blank page with words, right? So outlining the argument is one way of structuring. You could create headings that you may later either keep or reject, but at least you'd have something that can, that gives you an overview of your argument. And this organization can change as the argument develops, right? You're not locked into anything because it's just a draft, okay? Pardon me. And then freewheeling are text idea generating strategies that I talk about more on the next slide. Okay, so structuring, outlining the argument, situating the argument, stating how the issue will be treated. Arguments for, what are some of the arguments for, what are some of the arguments against, and then what supports those arguments or evidence. Second argument for, second argument against, and so forth. Pardon me. Okay, and then freewheeling, free writing, and generative writing. Okay, so drafting strategies, writing to prompts. And again, this is free writing and generative writing. And free writing helps the writer get the fingers moving, the ideas flowing. Because it's private, I mean, you could write swear words, you could call people names, you could do all kinds of things, right? No one will ever know because nobody ever sees it, right? Because you're prohibited from editing and because you're required to keep typing, writing, regardless of whether you have something to say or not. You're forced to just put down whatever comes into your head, right? This is free writing. If you've ever had a rush of ideas and lost about 90% of the ideas because you stopped to edit your iteration of your first idea, you know why this strategy works. Because the writer's free to deviate, the writer can focus on issues outside as well as inside the paper, like how the feedback on one of your papers has spooked you and caused you to procrastinate on the current paper. Free writing may generate text that will be included in your paper, but it may as well develop ideas that are important to your development as a writer, such as reflections on your process of production, your understanding of your writing situation, or social, cognitive, or affective obstacles that are blocking you from moving forward. Generative writing is usually associated with the production of ideas that are important to your paper. For instance, explaining complex concepts can be difficult. A prompt that asks you to explain the concept to a 10-year-old might be a way into an explanation, right? So free writing, responding to a prompt that may or may not address the topic of your paper. It may instead be a reflection on your process or a brainstorm about which aspect of the topic is most appealing to you, etc. You write for 5 minutes without stopping. You don't edit or censor what you write, right? It's private. You write in full sentences, in other words, incomplete ideas. They don't have to be beautiful sentences. They don't even have to be, punctuated properly or grammatical or anything like that. But you're writing in complete thoughts rather than bulleted thoughts, right, which are not complete thoughts. You feel free to deviate if you feel the deviation more productive, because that's what makes free writing free, right? It's just automatic writing. You just write down what's in your head. And sometimes doing that, you can fill a page pretty quickly, and sometimes that's enough to get you going. Generative writing is responding to a prompt designed to generate text that you'll likely be included in your paper, okay? So, you may give yourself a prompt to explain something or discuss something or to compare something to something else, and the ideas from that are going to generate text in your paper. So again, write for 5 minutes without stopping. Don't edit or censor what you write. The writing is private, but you want to write in full sentences, not bullets. And instead of deviating, if you feel like it, try to stay on the topic. Develop your ideas around the subject of the prompt. Okay, so these are freewheeling kinds of strategies of just generating text, and hopefully there's a golden nugget in there somewhere, and that's something that you can, put into your paper, and that's part of your paper written that you didn't have written 5 minutes earlier. Okay, so that's the presentation, and so that's all the fun we're going to have here today. So I'll let you go, but thank you for joining me. I hope this was helpful to you as you write. Cheers.